Well, good morning. And as people are logging on, we'll just give them a few seconds to get on here with us. Hope you're having a good Sunday morning. I know things are still not back to normal yet, although this is week 3 now of our not meeting publicly. But hopefully we're not getting too used to this. I don't really want this to become normal for us. Trying to keep as much normalcy as we can, but still have that anxiety at least of looking forward to getting back to being together. So while we're doing as much as we can to keep things as normal as possible, hopefully we're not getting so comfortable with this that we lose track of what we're looking forward to when we can be together again. While people are logging on, again, we'll just comment that hope everybody is staying safe and following procedures that are being handed down to us by health officials. We want everybody to do the best they can to stay healthy, and certainly those of us who are younger and not feeling like we have a whole lot to fear, we need to be aware, though, that we can be carriers and pass it on to other people that are more at risk. So let's continue to be safe and do all that we can in that way. If you have your Bible with you, want to turn to Matthew chapter 28. We're going to be focusing our attention this morning mainly on this account in Matthew, verses 1 through 10, regarding the resurrection of Jesus. The title of our lesson this morning is He is Risen. We know that this time of year, a lot of people are focusing on the resurrection of Jesus. Next Sunday, of course, is what the religious world calls Easter Sunday. But, to us, in a real sense, every Sunday, every first day of the week is Easter Sunday, in the sense that we remember and commemorate the death and the resurrection of Jesus when we partake of the Lord's Supper. I hope that you've had the opportunity, and if not, that you will have the opportunity on this same Facebook page to join with some singing that has been posted. It was posted earlier. And also the Lord's Supper. You can have some guidance there with partaking the Lord's Supper. And again, we know that this is not how we prefer to do things individually or in just small family settings, but it is something that we can be doing. And even though public assemblies are not meeting now, worship has not been canceled, and we can continue to worship God. We're going to be focusing this morning on this passage, Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. Next week, Lord willing, we'll continue looking at what the rest of the New Testament has to say about the resurrection of Jesus. This lesson has to do with the evidence of the resurrection as presented in the gospel accounts. Next week, we'll be looking at the presentation or the preaching of the resurrection of Jesus throughout the rest of the New Testament. So if you have your Bible with you, let's read together Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and Mary and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you." So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell the disciples. Behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." They came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." When we look at the writings of other people, when you read a biography of famous people, we see that this idea, the whole concept and the recording of the resurrection of Jesus actually completes the work of Jesus on earth. This is the consummation, you might say. Oftentimes we look at the cross and we say that Jesus was born to die. And he certainly was. He was born to offer himself as our sacrifice for our sins upon the cross. But beyond the cross, there is also the resurrection. And then, of course, from that, the ascension into heaven. And I think that sometimes we do ourselves an injustice if we focus these things or we isolate them and look at them one at a time. If we can see the bigger picture and we can see how they all fit together, how that the cross then leads to the resurrection and the resurrection to the ascension, and all of it fits together. And all the gospel writers record for us the death of Jesus. They spend a great amount of the time or a great amount of the space in their writings to the last week of Jesus. And of course, all of them also record the resurrection. Now, Luke is the only one who really records the ascension of Jesus, and he does it twice at the end of Luke chapter 24 and at the beginning of Acts chapter 1. But we find that all four gospel writers spend time with the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. When we look at this, we find that this is different from any other biography that you will read. When you read the biography of historical figures, a lot of times the author will relate the subject's life and death, the impact that that life has had on those whom he or she has influenced. And then oftentimes, if the person was one of great influence, such as a president of the United States or other political or military figure, a lot of times the author might, in his last chapter, spend time with the legacy of that person. In other words, what their policies have led to and the ongoing effect that those have had upon our nation or upon other peoples. But the Gospels are unique in the sense that when they tell about Jesus, they tell about his life, they tell about his works, they record his words. And all of the gospel writers are very upfront telling us that they don't record everything that Jesus said or did. John especially says in John chapter 20, beginning at verse 30, that many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples that were not written in this book. But these are written, you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you may have life in his name. And then in chapter 21, John goes on and says that Jesus did so many things that if they were all written down, he supposes even the whole world wouldn't be able to contain the books that should be written. So the gospel writers don't pretend to tell us every word that Jesus uttered, and they don't pretend to tell us every act that Jesus did, but they give us enough insight into the character of Jesus and into the teaching of Jesus and all that we need to know in order to believe in him, and believing in him find that eternal life that is so necessary for us. But every one of the gospel writers end by saying that he has risen. He has risen from the dead. Now, when you compare that with the biography of anybody else that you will read, nobody else has that at the end of their story. Nobody else's life is ever told by saying that they overcame death. They were buried, and oftentimes their tomb or their grave has been marked. Sometimes it even becomes a place where people will travel to see it. But in the case of Jesus, the tomb is empty. In the case of Jesus, he overcame death. He has risen twice here in Matthew chapter 28. In these 10 verses, you'll find where the angel says he has risen. He says that in verse 6, and then again down in verse 7, he has risen from the dead, even as he said. He had predicted that he would. He told his disciples that. They didn't understand it. It was beyond their comprehension at the time, but he had told them that he would be raised from the dead. And he did rise from the dead. When you read over in Revelation chapter 1, the vision that John has there in that opening vision of that revelation that he was given, he's seeing a vision of the Son of Man, the glorified Son of Man, and it describes him in very symbolic language. But when that one speaks, among the words that he says to John, I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. Nobody else says that. Nobody else can say that. Jesus is the one who lived, who died, who overcame death. Now, as we'll see in our next lesson next week, Lord willing, we'll also find that that promise is for us as well, but it's based upon the fact that we're studying today that Jesus was raised from the dead. He is risen. So for the remainder of our time this morning, I'd like for us to look at the evidence that we have concerning the resurrection of Jesus. And the first evidence we're going to look at is the evidence from the circumstances surrounding the burial of Jesus and the tomb in which he was laid. So there are four lines of evidence here. First of all, if you look back to Matthew chapter 27, the chapter right before where we began looking, you will find there that the Jewish leaders went to Pilate, the Roman governor, and they asked for a guard to be set at the tomb. Now, this guard that was set at the tomb, and we're not talking about just one person, a guard here is a noun here used to refer to a number of people, a group of people, but they asked for guard to be placed at the tomb. And the reason being, as you look in Matthew chapter 27, beginning verse 62, the next day, that is, the day after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate, and they said, "Sir, we remember how that impostor," and they're referring here now to Jesus because in their view that's what he was. He was an impostor as far as they were concerned. "We remember how that impostor said that while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people that he is risen from the dead, and the last fraud will be worse than the first." So Pilate said to them, "You have a guard. You have a guard of soldiers. Go and make it as secure as you can." So they went and made the tomb secure. So you have the guard. The guard is there at the tomb. Now, notice that the guard was placed not by Pilate himself, that is, it wasn't his original idea, but the Jewish leaders, the chief priests and the scribes. These were the people who were the ones who were instigators in wanting Jesus put to death in the first place. They'd been plotting this for a long time. Finally, because of Judas's betrayal, they had their opportunity. And it really wasn't even at the time that they wanted. They themselves, who looked at the first part of Matthew chapter 27, they said, "Not during the Passover, not during the feast, lest there be a riot among the people." And yet when Judas came offering to betray Jesus to them, to deliver him into their hands, then they took advantage of that opportunity and they said, sure, they gave him the money and he betrayed him into their hands. So it happened not on their time frame. But they were the ones who were the instigators, and they're the ones now who are putting pressure on Pilate and making sure that Pilate understands this is really in your best interest too. We don't want this impostor, as they're calling him, to perpetrate an even greater fraud by having his disciples steal his body and then say that he is risen from the dead. So Pilate gives them their request. He gives them the guard, the soldiers that are going to be placed there. Now we need to realize that since these guards have been placed by Pilate's decree, he's the one granting them, and they're called soldiers here. We need to realize that these are Romans. These would be men probably from the same group of men, maybe not exactly the same ones, but from the same group that were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. Now these men were Romans. They understood that when they are placed to guard something, that when they're guarding it, if something goes wrong, their lives are forfeit, that they will pay for it with their own lives. These men are going to take very seriously the charge that is given to them. So we have a guard there, and then we have a seal. At the end of Matthew chapter 27 in verse 66, they went and made the tomb secure. They placed the guard there, but then they also placed a seal across the stone. The stone had been rolled up over the mouth of the tomb. Remember, the tomb is described as being one hewn out of rock, and the body then was placed there, and then a stone was rolled over it to protect the body from predators and also, of course, to prevent the decomposition process from spreading its odor throughout the area there. But they had the stone, but they put the seal across it. Now, the seal was not something that would absolutely prevent people from getting into the stone. It's just like sealing an envelope. That doesn't prevent someone from getting into it, someone unauthorized. What it does, though, is to show you that if you get an envelope, I got one in the mail just the other day that had already been, it hadn't been sealed or hadn't been sealed properly. The seal wasn't closed when I pulled it out of the mailbox. I checked to make sure that everything that was supposed to be there was there, and apparently it was. But it indicates that somebody or somehow it had been broken. Somebody who wasn't supposed to had perhaps broken the seal. When you go to a certain store and you buy a card, a lot of times they will give you a seal to put on that card. And when you close it with that seal, that means that only the person that you're giving that card to is supposed to open it. If the seal is broken, then that person knows that somebody else has opened that card before them, somebody that perhaps wasn't supposed to and didn't have the authority to do so. So when they placed the seal here, the seal would have been a piece of clay that had the imprint probably of Pilate, the governor. And so anybody who broke that seal would be responsible to Pilate. They would be accountable to him. So by placing the seal there, they're not absolutely preventing someone from getting into the tomb. What they're doing is they're showing people that only an authorized person is supposed to be able to break that seal. And if it's broken, then they know that somebody unauthorized has attempted to enter into it. We're, again, familiar with seals these days on just about anything that we buy. Tamper-resistant packaging, they call it. And it doesn't mean that people can't get into it, but what it means is that if you pick it up, and of course most bottles now are medicine things, they'll have, if this seal is broken, do not use it, do not buy it. Well, the seal, again, is there to show that the product has not been tampered with. And if it has been broken, then it has been. So the seal that we read about there at the end of Matthew chapter 27, it was placed on the stone, not necessarily to keep somebody from actually getting into it, but to show that if somebody did, they have done so without proper authorization. So they sealed the stone, but the stone itself, when you look at Matthew chapter 27 and verse 60, they rolled a stone over a great stone, a large stone, to the entrance of the tomb, and then they went away. And Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there sitting opposite the tomb. They were watching where he had been laid. But that stone itself becomes part of the circumstance of the burial of Jesus, and in some ways a testimony and evidence of his resurrection. Because if you remember, the women, according to some of the gospel accounts, as the women were on their way to the tomb, they're talking among themselves, wondering, now, who's going to roll away the stone for us? In other words, they understood how big that stone was, and they knew that they didn't have the strength to do it, that it would probably take several different people involved with it, as we sometimes use the expression, people with a strong back, not necessarily a weak mind, but certainly a strong back. But it would take somebody with some strength to be able to roll that stone away from the entrance of the tomb. But of course, when they got there, the stone was already rolled away. Someone wrote a book several years ago on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and the title of the book was a question: who moved the stone? A man by the name of Frank Morrison wrote that book. I would recommend that you read it. It's a good book. Who moved the stone? Well, it wasn't the women. The women who were the first ones on the scene, they didn't move the stone. They were wondering who was going to move it for them, but when they got there, it was already moved. So we have the guard, we have the seal, we have the stone. But when they got there, they found that the tomb itself was empty. The empty tomb stands as a testimony for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, obviously, the tomb being empty in and of itself does not mean that Jesus was raised from the dead. Others have come along with other explanations as to how or why the tomb might have been empty. And there's some very minute plausibility. But when we consider all the rest of the evidence, then the conclusion is irresistible. It's not because the disciples stole away his body. That's the first thing that was said. Now, it's interesting when you look back up there to Matthew chapter 27. We just read that text a few moments ago regarding the guard and the chief priests and the Pharisees asking Pilate to have a guard placed there at the tomb. It's interesting that they did that in order to prevent the disciples from stealing away his body. Now, that's the last thing the disciples were going to do. Remember, as we said, Jesus had predicted several times that he would suffer, that he would die, and he would rise again on the third day. The disciples didn't understand it. They didn't even understand the part about his suffering and dying until it happened. They certainly didn't understand about his being raised from the dead. That wasn't anything that was within their experience. It wasn't anything that they were familiar with from the Old Testament scriptures. They were not anticipating it. They weren't expecting it, even though Jesus had said it. They were not going to be stealing the body of Jesus. As a matter of fact, the first thing we read about the disciples after the death of Jesus, when they were gathered together, they were in an upper room. We read this in the 20th chapter of John. They were together in an upper room with the doors closed for fear of the Jews. They were afraid. They had run away. They were not at all in an emotional state to try to steal the body of Jesus. That wasn't even on their radar, so to speak. They weren't going to steal that body. But the irony is, the very people who placed the guard and sealed the stone for the purpose of preventing the disciples from doing that, you know what they did? When the tomb was empty, they bribed those guards to say that the disciples came and stole the body. The very things that they set in place to prevent the disciples from stealing the body, now they have to turn around and say that that's what happened. The very thing that they were trying to prevent, now they're trying to foist on people, bribing the guards and even telling them that if the governor hears about it, we'll take care of it with him. You won't have to suffer the consequences of it. You see the irony there? Do you see how things are so twisted? These people who hired these guards and who set the guard actually end up doing away with the whole reason they did it by spreading this lie that the disciples came and stole his body. Another very, very unusual theory about the empty tomb is that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, and after he was laid in the tomb, he revived, and he was able then to move the stone himself and get out of the tomb. Now, it takes a whole lot more faith, I think, to believe that than it does to believe that this man who did all the things that Jesus did during his lifetime, that God would then raise him from the dead. Who is going to revive in a cold, dank, damp tomb without any air after having been beaten and having been crucified? And besides that, those men who crucified Jesus, those Roman soldiers, they knew how to crucify someone. They knew how to execute someone, and they knew when someone was dead. They didn't make any mistake of putting a man who was still alive into that tomb. But then again, these are just some ways that people try to explain away or try to come up with alternate theories concerning the empty tomb. The fact is that that tomb was empty on that first day of the week. So we've seen the circumstances with the guard, we've seen the circumstances with the seal and the stone and the empty tomb. Now, let's notice the evidence from the witnesses who were there. And the first witnesses, according to all four Gospels, you look in Matthew chapter 28, Mark chapter 16, Luke chapter 24, John chapter 20. The first verse of every one of those chapters tell us that the first ones on the scene early on the morning of that first day of the week following the crucifixion of Jesus, the first ones on the scene were the women. And their name, Mary Magdalene and another Mary, those are the ones mentioned by Luke, or by Matthew. Luke mentions some others, and John mentions some others also. But it's interesting that all four Gospels are in harmony in telling us that the very first witnesses to the empty tomb are the women. And not only that, but an angel, at least one, perhaps two angels, spoke to them. And that then as they turned and were going back away, Jesus appeared to at least one of them or more of them when you put all four accounts together. So you find then that these women become the first witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. They are the first to see the tomb empty, and they are the first to see him alive. Now, the reason that this is remarkable is because in the first century, the testimony of women was not something that would have really been admissible in a court of law, unless they are the only ones. But this is not how things were done in the first century. Women were not the first ones who would be chosen. But in the case of the resurrection of Jesus, it's the women who were the first ones there. If you notice in the account of the Gospels, also in the chapters that relate the crucifixion of Jesus, it's the women who were there watching. We do find that John was there, the disciple whom Jesus loved, because while he was being crucified, Jesus looked at his mother, his earthly mother, Mary, and he said, "Behold your son." And he looked at John and said, "Behold your mother." And he gave her into the care of him. John was there. The other apostles weren't even there. They had fled. They'd run. But the women were there, and the women were watching where Jesus was buried, and the women are the first ones on the scene to discover the tombs being empty and Jesus raised from the dead. Next, we find the testimony of Peter and John. In John chapter 20, verses 1 through 9, we find there that the women first found Peter and John. And these two, when they heard what the women are saying about the tombs being empty, they ran to the tomb. And the Bible says that it's the disciple whom Jesus loved, in Peter, which we believe the disciple whom Jesus loved was John. He outran Peter. He got there first. And when he got there, he stopped and he looked into the tomb. He kind of peered around and looked in, and he saw the clothes that Jesus was buried in, the linen cloths and the face cloth. Peter, however, when he got there, he just went on past John and went on into the tomb, and he examined things even more closely. When they saw it, when they saw the way that things were, they realized that this isn't, if somebody had stolen the body, they wouldn't have taken the trouble to unwrap him and leave the linen cloths there. They wouldn't have taken the time to take the face cloth off of him. If his body had been moved and buried someplace else, they wouldn't have done that. The way that the linen cloths were there and the face cloth was there, they understood that this is something unusual. Now, they hadn't seen him yet, but they saw the tombs being empty. They saw the circumstances of that, and they began wondering about what these women have said and their testimony. And then, of course, later we find that Jesus does indeed appear to them, and he shows himself to them. So we have the testimony of Peter and John going, finding the tomb empty, finding the circumstances of the tombs being empty, and then beginning to think about what all this means. And then thirdly, we find the testimony of Thomas. Now, this testimony of Thomas, I believe, is very telling, because in John chapter 20, we find in verses 24 to 29, earlier in the chapter, on that same day that he was raised from the dead, the first day of the week after his crucifixion, Jesus had appeared to the disciples who had met together. And as we said, they were in an upper room and they had the doors closed for fear of the Jews. And Jesus appeared in their midst, something that he hadn't done during his earthly ministry. Something's different about Jesus after his resurrection. He can appear suddenly, he can disappear suddenly. Having doors closed and walls, that doesn't stop him now. We don't find that during his public ministry, during his fleshly ministry, so to speak. But his resurrection body is different. But as they're there, the Bible says that he appeared to them and he speaks with them, but Thomas wasn't there. Later, the disciples see Thomas and they tell him, "We've seen the Lord." Thomas says, "Unless I see the print of the nails in his hand and place my hand in his side." Remember, a Roman soldier had pierced his side with a spear. "Unless I put my hand in his side and put my finger in the print of the nails, I will not believe." Well, on the next first day of the week, they're together again. Thomas is with them this time, and Jesus again appears in the midst of them. You ever been to meetings where the first thing they do in the meeting is to read the minutes of the last meeting, and then they say we need to conclude any old business before we take up new business? That's kind of what happens here in this occasion, because we find that the first thing that Jesus does when he appears the second time in John chapter 20, he addresses Thomas. This is the unfinished business, you might say, from the last meeting. Thomas wasn't with them. Jesus knows what he says. He says, Thomas, I want you to come here. I want you to see my hands. I want you to look at my feet. I want you to look at my side. I want you to put your hand here. I want you not to be faithless, but believing. And in John chapter 20 and verse 29, Thomas says, my Lord and my God. There are a number of different confessions of faith in that fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. This is the culmination of them. My Lord and my God. And it's right after this that John states what we read a few moments ago from John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, that, yeah, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples. We haven't recorded them all, but we have recorded these for this purpose, that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you might have life in his name. We want to be like Thomas, not faithless, but believing. We need to see Jesus for who he is as our Lord and our God. And then, of course, there are the disciples that Jesus spoke with on the road to Emmaus. Luke records this. He's the only one who records it over in Luke chapter 24. And you look there in verses 13 through 35, two men were walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Jesus begins walking along with them. He hears them talking, and they're kind of arguing with one another. Luke uses a word there that indicates that there was a discussion among them, and it might have been rather heated. And Jesus asks what they're discussing, and they tell him, well, don't you know the things that have happened? Are you the only one that's around Jerusalem that doesn't know about what happened with Jesus of Nazareth? We thought that he was the one who was going to be the redemption of Israel, but he's been crucified. But then some of our women have said that they have found the tomb empty, and they claim that they saw him risen from the dead. But the disciples, him they haven't seen. But anyway, they go on, and Jesus walks with them, and he ends up staying with them, and he breaks bread with them. And in the breaking of the bread, their eyes were opened, and they realized who he was. Before that, though, the Bible says that Jesus had opened their minds, that he had described to them and explained to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. An interpretation of the messianic prophecies by the Messiah himself. Can you imagine what a home Bible study that must have been for those two men? But then, finally, we have also the testimony of Saul of Tarsus. In Acts chapter 9, Luke records for us there what happened as Saul was on his way to Damascus. In chapters 22 and 26 in Acts, we find two more times where Paul himself relates that same experience. But I'm not going to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Look with me at verses 3 through 8 in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says here, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And then look at verse 8. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared unto me also. Someone has said that the conversion of Saul of Tarsus is one of the greatest testimonies, one of the greatest evidences for the resurrection of Jesus. How else can you explain a man who was raised as a Pharisee, trained by one of the greatest rabbis in the first century, Gamaliel, in his school at Jerusalem, had the zeal that Saul of Tarsus had in persecuting Christians, and the whole reason he was on his way to Damascus there in Acts chapter 9 to begin with was because he had letters of authority from the chief priests in Jerusalem to go to the synagogues of Damascus and to round up anybody who had confessed Jesus as the Messiah, bring them back to Jerusalem, and have them on trial. The man was zealous, and he was wreaking havoc, the Bible says, on the church. How else can you explain the great change in Saul of Tarsus? to give up, as he says in Galatians chapter 1, he was advancing among those of his own generation, those of his peers in the Jews' religion. He had a great uh, he had a great future, you might say, in store for him, ahead of him, had he stayed in the Jews' religion. He probably would have been one of the greatest rabbis in the history of Judaism. But he gave all that up. Why? And what did he give it up for? He didn't give it up for material wealth. As a matter of fact, the rest of his life, Paul spent traveling. He spent traveling, being in danger. If you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning at about verse 20 or so, you'll read there all the different things that he suffered for the name of Jesus Christ. Now, how and why does someone give up a position and a future that Saul of Tarsus may have had in order to suffer the kinds of things that he did if he knew that the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead was a lie? People don't suffer the things that Paul did for a lie if they know it's a lie. They might be deceived, but they're not going to do it if they know it's a lie. There's no way that Saul of Tarsus would have been deceived into thinking that he had seen the risen Christ if he had not seen the risen Christ. So we have all the circumstances of the tomb, the guard, the seal, the stone, the empty tomb, and then we have the evidence from the witnesses of the women and the Peter and John and Thomas and the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and then ultimately of Saul of Tarsus. We have all of this testimony coming to the conclusion, Jesus Christ is risen. We can have all the confidence, we can have all the assurance of Scripture behind us that Christ the Lord is risen today. As we said, next week, Lord willing, we'll continue looking at how the rest of the New Testament presents the teaching, the doctrine of the resurrection of Jesus. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we pause to thank you once more for the opportunity that we have to study together. We thank you for all those who have joined in with us for this study this morning. We thank you for the singing and the Lord's Supper that has been posted on our Facebook page earlier. We pray that those who have not yet done that will do so after this is over. We thank you for all those who in various places are joining their hearts and minds together and focusing them in worship to you today. And we thank you for the assurance that you have given us concerning your Son, Jesus Christ. Not only the fact that he lived, and not only the fact that he died, not even the fact that he died for our sins. We thank you for that. We thank you for raising him from the dead, and in doing so, giving us the assurance that all that he said and all that he claimed and all that he accomplished has been acceptable in your sight. Father, thank you for that great encouragement, for that great comfort, and thank you for giving us the evidence so that we can have a confident faith and assurance in these great truths. We pray, Father, that you'll be with us through the rest of our day. We thank you again for your providence, and we thank you for your care and for your love over us. Pray that you would be with those who are sick. Pray that you would be with those who are grieving. Pray that you will be with those of us as we look forward to the time when we can assemble together once more and have the fellowship with one another and the strength that we draw from that. Again, above all, we thank you for Jesus. It's in his name that we ask our blessings and we offer our thanks. Amen. We'll be back, Lord willing, at 5 o'clock this evening for another lesson. Tonight we'll be studying from the first chapter of the Gospel of John and some other passages also regarding Andrew, the brother of Peter. We hope you'll join us then. Until then, may the Lord richly bless you and keep you.